Fire, screaming, blood on the ground. That is what Native American warriors did to captured invaders. But the truth of what happened to European soldiers, settlers, and missionaries who fell into indigenous hands is far more complex, far more brutal, and far more strategically calculated than any Hollywood film has ever portrayed. Some captives were slowly tortured over 3 or 4 days, each hour more agonizing than the last, until they finally died. Some were adopted into families as replacements for lost sons, brothers, and fathers, and became fully accepted members of the tribe. Some were burned alive at the stake, while entire villages watched and celebrated. Some had their hearts cut out while still alive, boiled and eaten by their captors, as a ritualized act of sacred warfare. Some were forced to run between 2 lines of villagers armed with clubs, knives, and burning torches, and if they survived the ordeal, they might be allowed to live. What determined which fate met each captured invader? Age, gender, the tribe that captured them, the specific conflict in which they were seized, the number of tribal warriors killed in the raid, and, most importantly, whether the invader showed bravery or cowardice under torture. Today you will discover the terrible reality of what Native American warriors actually did to captured Europeans across 3 centuries of colonial warfare in North America. From the Iroquois Morning Wars of the 17th century to the frontier conflicts of the American Revolution. From the martyrdom of French Jesuit missionaries in Canada to the burning of Colonel William Crawford in Ohio in 1782. These are stories that have been almost completely erased from popular memory, but they happened, in gruesome detail, and they reveal something profound about the culture of warfare in indigenous North American societies before European conquest was complete. Let us start with the basics. When Native American warriors raided a European settlement or defeated a European military expedition, they captured survivors. But not everyone was taken alive. Adult men who resisted fiercely were often killed on the spot, hacked apart with tomahawks, shot with muskets, or dispatched with a knife. Elderly people who could not walk fast enough to keep pace with the raiding party were also killed immediately. Babies were sometimes killed because their cries could betray the group to pursuers, but women and children between roughly 6 and 15 years old were usually spared and taken. And adult men who showed enough physical strength to survive the return march were also taken alive. The reason was simple. These captives had value. They could be adopted, they could be traded, they could be ransomed. Or if none of those options were pursued, they could be tortured to death in a public ritual that served a specific religious and cultural purpose within the tribal community. The first thing that happened to a captive after the raid ended was the forced march. This was itself a test that many would not survive. Native raiders moved fast through wilderness terrain, often 30 or 40 kilometers per day, sometimes more, without regular food or water. Any captive who fell behind was killed on the spot. Any captive who tried to escape was killed immediately as an example to the others. Any captive who complained too much, cried too loudly, or showed too much weakness was killed. The march often lasted a week or more, depending on how far the war party had traveled from home. Captives arrived exhausted, starving, frostbitten in winter, sunburned in summer, and terrified about what awaited them. When the raiding party finally reached the village, the second great trial began, the gauntlet. Almost every eastern woodlands tribe practiced this ritual, especially the Iroquois Confederacy, the Algonquin peoples, and the Great Lakes tribes. The gauntlet was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. 2 lines of villagers, sometimes hundreds of them, formed a corridor. Men, women, children. All were armed with clubs, sticks, whips, knives, hot pokers, or burning torches. The captive was pushed to the beginning of the corridor and forced to run through it. As he ran, the villagers beat him, cut him, burned him, tripped him, and screamed abuse at him. If the captive fell during the gauntlet, he might be beaten to death right there. If he made it to the end, panting, bleeding, half-conscious, he had passed the first test. He had shown enough physical courage to potentially be worth keeping alive. At this point, the fate of the captive was decided. There were 3 main possibilities. First, adoption. Second, slow ritual torture ending in death. Third, being kept as a slave for menial labor. The decision was made by tribal elders in consultation with the family who had suffered the most recent losses. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and least understood practices of Native American warfare: the Mourning War. The Iroquois Confederacy, made up of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, practiced systematic mourning wars throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. When a family member died, whether from disease, from combat, or from any other cause, the family had a spiritual obligation to raid enemy territory and capture a replacement. The captive would be adopted into the family and take the place of the deceased. He would receive the name of the dead person. He would receive the property of the dead person. He would be treated in every way as if he were the original family member returned from death. This practice served multiple purposes. It maintained tribal population in the face of devastating losses. It gave grieving families a concrete way to work through their sorrow, and it fulfilled deep religious beliefs about the movement of spirits between the living and the dead. But not every captive was adopted. The Iroquois in particular had a strict hierarchy of what to do with captives. Young children were almost always adopted. Adult women were usually adopted, though older women might be killed or enslaved. Young men who showed promise were often adopted, but older men, especially warriors, and especially enemy warriors who had killed Iroquois in combat, were reserved for something else entirely. They were reserved for ritual torture. And this brings us to the darkest and most infamous practices of Native American warfare: the ritual torture of adult male captives among the Iroquois and their allies could last anywhere from a few hours to 3 or 4 days, depending on the endurance of the captive and the elaborate nature of the ceremony. The torture was public. It took place in the center of the village, often around a large post to which the captive was tied. The entire community gathered to participate: warriors, women, children, elderly. Everyone had a role. The captive was gradually mutilated in stages designed to prolong his suffering while giving him opportunities to demonstrate his warrior courage. His fingernails were pulled out one by one. His fingers were broken, then bitten off, or cut off with knives. Burning torches were held against his flesh until it blackened and blistered. Splinters of pine wood, soaked in resin so they burned like candles, were inserted under his skin and lit on fire. His nose might be cut off, his ears might be cut off, his eyes might be gouged out. And the most horrifying practice of all was scalping while the victim was still alive. The scalp was cut around the crown of the head with a sharp flint or steel knife, then peeled off with a violent tug. The victim, if he survived this, then had boiling water or hot ashes poured on his exposed skull. Many died during this process, but some remarkably survived even scalping and continued to be tortured for hours or days more. Throughout the torture, the captive was expected to sing his death song. Every warrior culture in indigenous North America taught its young men that they must be prepared to die courageously, in battle or captivity. They were taught songs, called death songs, that they would sing during their final ordeal. These songs boasted of their war deeds, mocked their captors, and expressed contempt for pain and death. A brave captive who sang his death song loudly, who insulted his tormentors, who laughed at their attempts to break him, earned enormous respect. His captors would sometimes praise his courage as they tortured him, telling each other that this was a true warrior. A captive who cried, begged, or showed fear was despised. His captors would prolong his suffering to punish his cowardice. Either way, the captive died. But the manner of dying determined how he would be remembered in the oral history of the tribe. Now let us look at specific historical cases, because these are not abstract descriptions. They actually happen to real historical figures, and detailed accounts of their sufferings have survived in written records that we can still read today. The most famous case in North American colonial history is that of Father Jean de Brébeuf. Jean de Brébeuf was a French Jesuit missionary born in Normandy in 1593. He came to New France in 1625 and spent most of his life working among the Wendat, also called the Huron people, in the area around Georgian Bay in modern Ontario. He learned the Wendat language fluently, wrote the first grammar of that language, and composed hymns in it. On March 16, 1649, a war party of about 1,000 Iroquois warriors attacked the Wendat village of Saint Louis, where Brebeuf was living. The Wendat, weakened by decades of European disease, were overwhelmed. Brebeuf and his fellow missionary, Father Gabriel Lalemant, were captured. What happened next is documented in shocking detail by Jesuit accounts from the survivors. Brebeuf was tied to a stake. The Iroquois warriors, who considered him personally responsible for the Wendat resistance because of his missionary work, decided to torture him with maximum brutality. They mocked his Christianity by conducting what they called a baptism. They poured pot after pot of boiling water over his head, telling him that this was the water of salvation. They cut strips of skin from his body while he still lived. They put a red-hot iron collar around his neck. They put a belt of pitch and resin around his waist and set it on fire. They cut off his lips because he continued to preach to them and to the Wendat prisoners even during his torture. They cut off pieces of his flesh and roasted them in front of him, then ate them as he watched. And finally, when he was nearly dead, they cut open his chest, tore out his heart while it was still beating, and each of the leading warriors drank a mouthful of his blood, believing that the blood of such a courageous man would give them courage in their own battles. Brebeuf died at approximately 4 in the afternoon on that same day. He had endured about 4 hours of continuous torture. Gabriel Lalemant, who was smaller and physically weaker than Brebeuf, endured a different ordeal that lasted much longer. He was tortured for 17 hours before finally dying at 9 in the morning on March 17th. His body was similarly mutilated. His skin was cut off in strips. Burning torches were applied to his flesh continuously. Hot ashes were poured on his head, and he too was scalped alive and had his heart cut out and eaten. The Jesuit accounts of these martyrdoms became famous throughout Europe and were used to promote the cause of Catholic missions in the Americas. Both Brebeuf and Lalemant were canonized as saints by Pope Pius XI in 1930. Their skulls are preserved to this day in the church at Midland, Ontario, where visitors can still see them. Another famous case involves Isaac Jogues, another French Jesuit missionary. In 1642, Jogues and a party of Wendat allies were captured by Mohawk raiders on the St. Lawrence River. Jogues was tortured in stages over more than a year of captivity. His thumbs and forefingers were cut off with clamshells because they were the fingers he used to hold the Eucharist during Mass. His remaining fingers were broken, one by one. He was made to eat pieces of his own fingers that had been cooked. He was burned repeatedly with torches. He was made to walk through the gauntlet more than once. Miraculously, Jogues survived this year of ordeal and eventually escaped with the help of Dutch traders in Albany. He returned to France, where he became a celebrity, and was even granted a special papal dispensation to celebrate Mass despite his mutilated hands. But in 1646, he returned voluntarily to the Iroquois to attempt further missionary work. He was captured again, and this time killed almost immediately, tomahawked in the head as he entered the Mohawk village. The pattern of ritual torture continued throughout the colonial period, applying not just to Jesuit priests, but to any captured warrior deemed worthy of the honor. During the American Revolution and the frontier wars that followed, there are numerous documented cases of American soldiers and settlers being tortured in similar fashion. The most famous case from the Revolutionary period is that of Colonel William Crawford. Crawford was a longtime friend of George Washington, a Virginia militia officer, and a veteran of Braddock's defeat in 1755. In May 1782, he led an American expedition against the Delaware, Wyandot, and Shawnee villages in the Sandusky region of Ohio. The expedition was a disaster. Crawford's men were routed by a combined Native American force allied with British Rangers. Crawford himself was captured by the Delaware, whom the Americans called the Lenape. The Delaware were furious at Crawford because just months earlier, American militia had massacred 96 peaceful Christian Delaware men, women, and children at the town of Gnadenhutten in Ohio. The victims had been Moravian converts to Christianity who had refused to fight. The American militia had killed them anyway, systematically bludgeoning them with wooden mallets while they prayed. When the Delaware captured Colonel Crawford, they decided he would pay the price for Gnadenhutten. On June 11, 1782, at a Delaware village near modern-day Upper Sandusky, Ohio, Colonel Crawford was tied to a post in the center of the village. The Delaware chief, Captain Pipe, gave a long speech about the crimes of the Americans against the Delaware people. Then the torture began. Crawford was stripped naked. His face and body were painted black, which was the Delaware sign of a condemned prisoner. The women and warriors of the village then began to torture him. They cut off his ears. They fired dozens of loads of gunpowder into his flesh at close range, without bullets, so that the powder blackened and burned his skin without killing him. They pulled out his fingernails. They poured hot coals on his flesh. They pressed burning brands against his body. This lasted for hours. Crawford begged to be shot, saying that he would prefer death to further suffering. His pleas were ignored. Simon Girty, an American loyalist who had defected to the British and was watching the torture, is reported to have laughed at Crawford's suffering. Finally, after several hours of continuous torture, when Crawford could no longer stand, the Delaware women threw hot coals on him and then scalped him while he was still alive. They then poured burning coals on his exposed skull. Crawford, who was still barely conscious, was then killed by a tomahawk blow to the head. His body was thrown into the fire. Dr. John Knight, another American captive who witnessed Crawford's death and later escaped, provided the detailed account of the torture that survives today. Now we should also discuss the practice of ritual cannibalism, which is one of the most difficult aspects of Native American warfare to talk about honestly. It is well documented among the Iroquois, the Huron, and some other eastern woodlands tribes. The practice was not casual cannibalism for food. It was highly ritualized and had specific spiritual meanings. When a brave captive was tortured to death, warriors of the tribe would sometimes eat pieces of his body, especially his heart, in the belief that they would absorb his courage and spiritual power. Drinking his blood was a way of taking his warrior soul into themselves. This practice was widely documented by European observers who witnessed it, and by tribal elders who later described it to anthropologists. It has been observed among the Iroquois specifically during the 17th century, and there are also accounts from among the Comanche, Apache, and some Plains tribes of ritual consumption of enemy body parts during the 18th and 19th centuries. But not all captives faced this fate. As we mentioned earlier, many were adopted. Some captives, especially women and young children, integrated so successfully into their new tribes that they refused to return to European society when given the chance. Mary Jemison, captured by the Seneca in 1758, refused all ransom offers and lived among the Seneca until her death at age 81. Cynthia Ann Parker, captured by the Comanche in 1836, married a Comanche chief and had 3 children, including Quanah Parker, the last great Comanche leader. Olive Oatman, captured by the Mojave in 1851, received traditional blue chin tattoos and lived with the Mojave for 4 years, then hid her tattoos with veils for the rest of her life after her rescue. These were not victims in any simple sense. They were transformed people who had crossed a cultural boundary that most European colonists could not even imagine. Some captives were kept as slaves for menial labor, especially among the tribes that had extensive interaction with the Spanish, French, or English colonial powers. There was a market for enslaved Europeans. Captives could be traded to allied tribes. They could be sold to the French or Spanish for money, weapons, or trade goods. They could be ransomed back to their original families for large payments. This was actually the most common outcome for captured Europeans in the colonial period. Death by torture was reserved for the highest status captives and for symbolic reasons. Most captives ended up either adopted, enslaved, or eventually ransomed. Some captives were deliberately released to spread terror. When Native American war parties wanted their enemies to know exactly what they were capable of doing, they would sometimes release a mutilated captive, letting him walk back to European settlements with his ears cut off, his nose slit, or other visible marks of torture. This served as a form of psychological warfare. The returned captive told his story, and the fear it inspired often kept European settlers away from native lands for months or years. The Iroquois were particularly known for this practice, deliberately using terror as a strategic weapon. Why did Native American warriors practice these terrible rituals? There are several important reasons that we must understand to make sense of this history. First, torture served a religious function in most woodlands cultures. The suffering of a captive was believed to please spiritual beings. The bravery of a captive was believed to transfer to those who killed him. His blood and body parts were sacred substances that could be used in specific rituals. This was not casual cruelty, it was religious observance, comparable in some ways to the human sacrifices practiced by the Aztecs and Maya. Second, torture served a social function. It was a way for the entire community, especially the women and children, to participate in the war effort. Everyone had a role, everyone had a chance to strike the enemy, everyone shared in the ritual bloodshed. This built community solidarity in cultures without armies, governments, or state institutions. Third, torture served a psychological function. It processed the grief of families who had lost members in warfare. When your son or brother had been killed in a raid, participating in the torture of a captured enemy provided a form of emotional release. Modern therapists would recognize this as a highly effective, if morally troubling, form of collective grief management. Fourth, torture served a political function. It sent a message to enemy tribes and European colonial powers about the costs of provoking a particular tribe. The Iroquois specifically used ritual torture as a form of terror diplomacy. This calculated cruelty was a genuine strategic tool. Now, before we conclude, we should also remember something important. European invaders were not innocent victims of some uniquely brutal Native American culture. European colonial powers committed their own atrocities on a scale that vastly exceeded anything the Native American tribes ever did. The Gnadenhutten massacre we mentioned, the Sand Creek massacre of 1864, the Wounded Knee massacre of 1890, the Trail of Tears in the 1830s which killed roughly 4,000 Cherokee, and the deliberate infection of native tribes with smallpox through contaminated blankets at Fort Pitt in 1763. All these are documented examples of colonial atrocities on a scale that dwarfed the ritual torture of individual captives by native warriors. The truth is that colonial warfare in North America was brutal on both sides. The Native American torture rituals we have described were terrible. But they were also part of a defensive struggle by peoples fighting for the survival of their cultures, their lands, and their ways of life against an invading force that eventually destroyed most of their civilizations entirely. What should we take away from these grim stories? First, that human warfare in every culture and every era produces terrible atrocities. There is no innocent culture in the history of organized violence. Second, that the specific rituals of Native American torture were not random cruelty, but were embedded in complex spiritual, social, and political systems that we must understand in their own terms. Third, that many captured Europeans, despite the terrifying possibility of ritual torture, were actually adopted and lived long, integrated lives among the tribes that captured them. Some of them, like Mary Jemison, refused all offers to return to European society. Fourth, that the European conquest of North America involved its own systematic brutality on a scale that vastly exceeded anything the native tribes ever did to European captives. And finally, that these stories, however difficult they are to hear, should be remembered, because to forget them would be to sanitize the past. And a sanitized past cannot teach us anything about the reality of human conflict, cruelty, or courage. The next time you watch a Hollywood film about the American frontier or read a school textbook about colonial history, remember what really happened. Remember Father Brebeuf tied to the stake, boiling water poured over his head, singing hymns until they cut off his lips. Remember Colonel Crawford stripped naked and painted black, gunpowder loads fired into his skin, begging to be shot as the Delaware women scalped him alive. Remember Mary Jemison, refusing all ransom offers, choosing to live and die among the Seneca who had captured her as a child. Remember Cynthia Ann Parker, torn from her Comanche family in a rescue she never wanted, dying of grief in a white Texas cabin 20 years later. These stories are the real history of North America. They are not comfortable. They are not simple. They are not stories with heroes and villains. They are stories of human beings on both sides of a terrible cultural collision doing what human beings have always done in war: killing each other in ways that reveal, more than anything else, how strange and terrible and complicated our species really is, and how much we still have to learn about ourselves 400 years after these events took place, in the forests and prairies of a continent whose true history we have barely begun to understand.